Nobody expected a silk dhoti and a battered leather box to hold the equation that would change how we think about reality. Ramanujan walked into Cambridge as a quiet prodigy and left with pages full of symbols no one could explain. He told people the goddess Namagiri gave him the lines in dreams. He also wrote formulas that, a century later, feed into how physicists measure black hole entropy. That gap between ritual and modern physics is where this story lives. Reporters and scholars traced his last lecture, hospital files, family letters, and a pile of loose sheets labelled the Lost Notebook. Along the way, neighbours reported strange visitors, and temple priests kept ritual diaries. What they uncovered raised more questions than answers. Some of his final notes line up with ideas that only appeared much later in quantum theory. Others point to conclusions no one has been able to match. His illness, his warnings, and his abrupt return to India all sit beside pages that hint at a model of the universe far ahead of his era. In today's video, we will look at the claims, the sources, and the strange path that turned his final work into one of the most debated stories in modern math. Srinivasa Ramanujan was a self-taught mathematical genius from India who arrived at Cambridge in 1914. Despite limited formal training, he quickly made a deep impression on the British academic community. His work was unlike anything seen before, with strange formulas appearing on scraps of paper, often without proofs or explanations. Yet G.H. Hardy, one of England's leading mathematicians, recognised their importance and became Ramanujan's mentor and collaborator. About 3 years after arriving at Cambridge, Ramanujan's health began to decline sharply. Despite struggling with a persistent illness, he continued to produce remarkable mathematics. By the early summer of 1917, he was in such poor shape that he entered a nursing home in Cambridge. From that point on, he spent almost 2 full years moving between sanatoria and nursing homes. Doctors tried to figure out what was wrong with him. The first guess was tuberculosis, along with a severe vitamin shortage. Before that, some even wondered if he had a gastric ulcer. Nothing seemed certain, and nothing seemed to help for long. He was sent to different places to rest and recover. Around October 1917, he was moved to the Mendip Hills Sanatorium at Hill Grove. The next month, he was transferred to Matlock House Sanatorium in Derbyshire, where he stayed for much of the following year. Even in these quiet, isolated places, his situation was made worse by wartime food shortages. Ramanujan followed a strict vegetarian diet, and getting the foods he needed was almost impossible. That lack of proper nutrition weakened him even more and left him open to illness. During this period, his emotional state fell apart as well. He sank into a deep depression that grew heavier over time. At one point, he attempted to take his own life by stepping in front of a train in a London subway station. The train stopped just in time, leaving him with only minor injuries, but the incident showed how overwhelmed he had become. There were a few bright moments that lifted his spirits. In December 1917, he was elected to the London Mathematical Society. The recognition gave him a small burst of encouragement, at a time when he badly needed it. Through all of this, Hardy did everything he could to support him. Hardy believed that honouring Ramanujan's achievements would help keep him motivated, and he was right. On February 28, 1918, Ramanujan was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He became only the second Indian in history to receive the honour and one of the youngest ever. Even while dealing with constant illness, he created some of his greatest works during this time. He produced the famous Hardy-Ramanujan formula for counting how many ways a number can be broken into smaller numbers. More honours followed. In October 1918, he was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, becoming the first Indian to receive that distinction. By November, his health showed signs of improvement. His temperature evened out, he gained weight, and doctors thought he might be recovering from what they described as an obscure form of blood poisoning. All of this made it seem as though he was finally turning a corner, even if only for a short time. By late February, Ramanujan was well enough to handle his passport paperwork, and on February 27, 1919, he set out for Cheput, India. When Ramanujan came back to India, everyone expected him to get much better. Instead, things went the other way. Within weeks, his health began slipping faster than anyone could handle. There were constant arguments in the house, fevers that never broke, and stomach pain that left him curled up for hours. His wife Janaki, later said he became so thin she could count the bones in his arms. The family doctor, a man named Chandrasekhar from the Madras Medical College, started visiting him that September. He believed Ramanujan had tuberculosis. Friends and family said he was no longer calm or patient like before. His temper came and went without warning. The family record even mentioned a rumour that he had gone mad. He would yell, throw things across the room, and sometimes sit completely silent for hours. Even as his body fell apart, his mind stayed locked on his work. People in the house heard him talking to himself at night, whispering numbers and writing in the dark. Sometimes he worked until morning, lying flat on the floor, with a slate balanced on his knees. When he was too weak to move, Janaki would hand him his slate and gather the papers he filled with strange formulas. According to his own words, these ideas came from dreams. He told Janaki that the goddess Namagiri showed him numbers in his sleep. Even through the pain and the confusion, the routine stayed the same. He would whisper calculations, pause to catch his breath, and then start again. The people around him thought he was slipping away, but his notebooks show the opposite. His body was failing, yet his work had never moved faster. That strange mix of weakness and unstoppable focus was what filled those final months inside the small house at Chetput, India. By the final week of April 1920, Ramanujan's condition had collapsed completely. He could no longer stand or even shift in bed without help. Eating became impossible, and he turned away most of the treatments offered to him. His doctor wrote that he could hardly sit up. His fever stayed high no matter what they tried, and each breath sounded thin and tired. Day by day, he grew quieter and weaker, as if his body was giving up faster than anyone could keep up with. On April 26, 1920, Ramanujan's strength ran out, and he passed away. The doctors of the time wrote that tuberculosis was the cause. It was the same diagnosis that had followed him from England. The funeral came quickly. It was small and tense. Most people in his community stayed away. They believed that because he had sailed across the seas, his body had become impure, and performing his rites would bring them bad luck. Even the priest who was supposed to do the ceremony left in fear. In the end, Ramachandra Rao, a close supporter, arranged for the cremation himself. After his funeral, attention turned to his belongings. His wife Janaki kept the box that held his papers. Inside were loose pages filled with formulas, written in his hand, even as he lay dying. 4 days before his death, he had still been writing. Within a few weeks, Janaki handed the papers and notebooks to the University of Madras in India. In 1923, Francis Drewsbury sent most of these documents to G.H. Hardy at Trinity College. The box reached Cambridge with his final mathematical work inside. Hardy later passed the papers to the English mathematician G.N. Watson, who kept them in his study. After Watson died in 1965, the room was being cleared for disposal when J.M. Whittaker arrived to collect material for an obituary. He noticed a pile of unsorted notes and pulled several sheets at random. That small act saved the papers from being burnt. Whittaker sent them to Scottish mathematician R.A. Rankin at Glasgow University, who returned them to Trinity College in 1968. There they remained, tucked away in storage, until the American mathematician George Andrews found them in 1976 in a box at the Wren Library. Those same pages, written in the last months of Ramanujan's life and moved from hand to hand for over 50 years, became known as the Lost Notebook. Those who later examined the notes said it felt like walking into the middle of a lecture that had been cut short. There were no introductions or explanations, just rows of equations written carefully in Ramanujan's small handwriting. From Ramanujan's final year read like a mix of hope, pain, and quiet surrender. Each one shows how hard he tried to stay focused while his health slipped away. In January of 1919, he wrote to the registrar of the University of Madras, saying he was sorry he had not done much mathematics in the past 2 years, and that he would try harder to be worthy of the help he had been given. That line alone shows how guilty he felt for being sick. He was weak, but he still thought he was letting everyone down. The letter that came a year later, on January 12th of 1920, was the last one he ever sent to G.H. Hardy. It filled about 4 typewritten pages and described 17 new power series that no one had ever seen before. He listed formula after formula, hundreds of them, but there were no proofs. The way he wrote makes it seem like the ideas came faster than he could explain them. Some people think he was working from instinct, while others believe he was writing down what he saw in visions that felt real to him. Ramanujan had always said his ideas came from the goddess Namagiri. In earlier letters, he described seeing her in dreams, showing him numbers and patterns that he would write down as soon as he woke up. In one dream, he said he saw a red screen made of flowing blood, and a hand appeared and wrote on it. When he woke up, the results were still in his mind, and he copied them exactly as they had appeared. It sounds strange, but to him it explained everything. He once wrote that an equation meant nothing unless it expressed a thought of God. That belief guided all of his work, especially during those last months when he spent most of his time in bed with paper and ink beside him. The letters Hardy sent back were full of concern, but they also showed how much pressure Ramanujan was under. Hardy wanted him to keep producing, even while acknowledging that he was very ill. He told him to rest, but also asked about new problems he might explore when he felt better. For Ramanujan, that mix of care and expectation weighed heavily. He wrote about being tired and weak, and his doctor later said he had lost the will to live. Still, his notes from that same time were filled with the boldest ideas of his career. Every line suggested he was racing against time, trying to save whatever he could before his strength ran out. Hardy later said he felt both admiration and unease while reading them, since each new batch hinted at how far Ramanujan had pushed himself. His final work, later known as the Lost Notebook, held more than 600 formulas. They covered ideas Hardy recognized but couldn't fully explain, mostly about something Ramanujan called mock theta functions. He looked at how numbers act when they get really close to certain limits, like they're about to jump or change suddenly. He said these number patterns were beautiful because they could be written neatly and simply, even though it took a lot of time and hard work to figure them out. One part of his notes was about something called F of QU. It's like a long list made by adding lots of little pieces, and this list goes on forever. Each piece fits together in a pattern, like building blocks stacked carefully one after another. Even though it sounds simple, this was a totally new kind of math that nobody had seen or understood before. People who saw these notes later said it felt like walking into a class, halfway through and trying to catch up without any introduction. Ramanujan didn't explain everything. He just wrote down the important parts and hoped someone else would figure out the rest one day. He wrote down 16 more series like that, all without any proof. He didn't bother to explain what they meant or how they worked. For Hardy, and for everyone who saw them later, this was the whole lesson. Just a bunch of formulas left floating there with no answers. At the very bottom of one of the pages, written in his fading ink, is the closest thing to his spoken words. Ramanujan was asking if the reverse of certain math rules could be true. Basically, he wanted to know if every special kind of number pattern had to be made up of two parts. The first part would follow a regular and well-understood pattern, something mathematicians call a modular form. Think of this like a shape or design that repeats predictably. The second part would be very small and simple. It wouldn't change much, no matter what numbers you used. It was almost like background noise that stays quiet and steady all the time. Then, right below, he gave his own answer. He said the opposite is not necessarily true. That single note turned out to be his last known explanation. But that small comment at the bottom of the page has made many people wonder who else might have wanted a look at his work. Stories began spreading years after Ramanujan's death about quiet visitors who came to his house at night. People claimed that men in dark European coats walked through the narrow lane leading to Gometra, the home where he spent his final months. Shopkeepers nearby said they sometimes saw them stop outside the gate, talk softly for a few minutes, and then leave. A few said they carried small sealed envelopes that were passed through the half-open door before they disappeared back into the night. The tale grew over time until it became a regular part of local gossip about the dying mathematician. In some retellings, the men are described as British officers who came to collect confidential mathematical papers. In others, they are portrayed as students or secret messengers from the university. But why would anyone go to such lengths unless the papers held something unusual? Let's take a look at some theories that try to make sense of what Ramanujan might have been onto. Some researchers argue that Ramanujan's final ideas go beyond ordinary mathematics and touch on something fundamentally deeper. They focus on his mock theta functions, a collection of formulas he shared with Hardy shortly before his death. At the time, these functions puzzled even the brightest mathematicians because they didn't fit into the existing framework of theta functions, which were well studied and understood. Over a century later, those same functions have resurfaced in surprising places within physics, especially in fields like string theory and the study of black holes. Experts like Ken Ono have pointed out that these mock theta functions help calculate black hole entropy, which is basically how much information a black hole can hold. What's surprising is that black holes and their science weren't even known when Ramanujan was alive. Because of this, some people think his work isn't just about math. It might actually reveal how the universe is built at its core. People who believe this say Ramanujan was seeing the basic building blocks of reality itself. They look at his stories about visions as moments when his mind reached a level of understanding most people can't. Ramanujan talked about how his family goddess, Namagiri, showed him equations in dreams, written in bright red like flowing blood on a screen. For those who follow this idea, that sounds less like a legend and more like someone catching a glimpse of the raw data that makes up everything around us. This perspective aligns with the simulation theory, which suggests that reality is essentially made of pure information, much like a computer's code creates a digital world on a screen. Some physicists, like Lawrence Krauss, say we might never be able to fully prove this idea because of certain limits in math, but others think those limits only make the whole thing more mysterious and amazing. They believe Ramanujan's special formulas might be the closest anyone has gotten to cracking the code that runs the universe. To them, it's like reality is made up of patterns and information that go way beyond what we usually think is possible. But how did Ramanujan come up with these incredible ideas in the first place? Some say it wasn't just math, but something closer to a spiritual experience. Many believe Ramanujan didn't discover his math through effort alone, but through something beyond human understanding. They say the numbers came from the goddess Namagiri, who spoke through him during moments of possession. In his family's temple in Tamil Nadu, priests still describe nights when he slipped into trances and filled pages with equations while his eyes stayed closed. They mention these sessions as moments when the goddess used his hand to write, turning mathematics into a kind of prayer. Ramanujan never doubted that this was real. He often said the goddess showed him the formulas in his sleep. In that account where he described seeing a red screen made of flowing blood and a handwriting across it, tracing elliptic integrals and long lines of numbers, he wasn't talking about a simple dream. To him, it was a clear message, a direct connection to something beyond the ordinary. Those moments felt like a voice guiding his hand, turning complex math into something almost sacred. Many who study his life believe this wasn't just imagination, but a genuine experience that shaped his work in ways few can understand. People close to him, like Ramachandra Rao and P.V. Seshu Iyer, recalled how he spoke of these experiences as revelations rather than calculations. He often worked inside the Namagiri temple, drawing figures on the floor with chalk. To him, maths was sacred communication. He once said that an equation meant nothing unless it expressed a thought of God. The goddess to him was not symbolic but real, a living source revealing how the universe was structured. Stories from his hometown also tell how the goddess guided his biggest decisions. When his mother refused to let him travel to England because of religious rules, she later changed her mind after dreaming that Namagiri told her to allow it. To the family, that dream showed that his path was chosen. Supporters believe her guidance continued even after his death, and that his own verses predicted he would return once the formula she gave him was finally understood. But what if the story doesn't end with divine guidance? There's another theory that takes us from temples to the stars. When you set the temple stories aside, a new explanation steps in, one that focuses on something far beyond Earth. This version suggests that Ramanujan's ideas did not come from dreams or spiritual guidance at all, but from contact with a non-human intelligence. Supporters say this began with a series of strange reports from the coastline. Telegraph workers, radio operators, and signal tower attendants occasionally wrote about brief pulses of sound that cut through the usual traffic. These pulses didn't follow any known rhythm used by ships, traders, or military stations. They arrived in tight clusters that looked meaningless at first, but seemed to repeat in a way that felt deliberate. People who follow this theory believe those transmissions carried information that humans at the time could not decode. They argue that Ramanujan, for reasons no one can fully explain, was sensitive to these patterns. Instead of hearing them through equipment, they think he processed them directly, the way some people claim to sense music or colour without any outside source. His mind in this version of the story was naturally tuned to structures hidden in those signals. When he talked about long chains of numbers unfolding in front of him, or handwriting flowing across a red screen in his sleep, supporters saw those moments as his brain translating something too complex to appear in its original form. They say he described a goddess only because he needed a human idea to explain an experience that felt powerful and overwhelming. The red screen, the moving symbols, and the sudden clarity of the formulas all become signs of a person receiving information he had no language for. Followers of the theory often point to the way he worked. Ramanujan produced results without showing the steps, as if the conclusions simply appeared in his mind. His notebooks are filled with formulas that were far ahead of the tools available at the time. Many of them connect perfectly with areas of science that developed long after he died. In fields like quantum theory, string research, and black hole physics, his equations appear with surprising precision, lining up with ideas he never lived to hear about. To believers, this accuracy is not something that can be brushed aside. They see it as evidence that he was not guessing or getting lucky, but working with information from a source that understood the universe at a level humans were nowhere near. They argue that no one accidentally writes down mathematics that later becomes essential to describing particles, gravity, and the behavior of space itself. For them, the simplest explanation is that Ramanujan received knowledge from an intelligence far ahead of anything on Earth, and his notebooks are the only record of that contact. But if that sounds intense, the next part takes things even further, because the story shifts into territory that feels much bigger than wartime math. The secret program theory claims that Ramanujan's years in England placed him inside a confidential wartime initiative that relied on his mathematical skill for military code work. Supporters note that he reached Cambridge in 1914, only weeks before the First World War began. By then, Britain had already started gathering mathematicians to help build secure communication systems for the front lines, and Ramanujan's ability to pull structure out of chaos would have made him a prime candidate. According to this version, he was quietly brought into an experimental group that tested early methods for building complex ciphers. Life in England was harsh for him during those years. His strict vegetarian diet clashed with the scarcity caused by wartime rationing. The lack of proper nutrition weakened him quickly, eventually forcing his move to a nursing home. People who support the secret program idea claim this frail state made it easier for officials to oversee his surroundings. They argue that his declining condition not only reflected illness, but also provided a convenient reason to limit what he could release once his formulas began creeping close to classified material. Medical files from that period complicate the picture. Some doctors labelled his sickness as tuberculosis, but Hardy privately questioned that diagnosis, noting that several symptoms failed to match. Modern researchers have suggested hepatic amoebiasis, a treatable infection he might have carried from India. Those who believe the coding theory say the disagreement over his condition created enough confusion to hide what was happening. In their view, calling his health problems terminal allowed authorities to quietly end his participation without attracting attention. The story continues with the fate of his last body of work. During his final year, Ramanujan filled notebooks with fresh formulas, including the mock theta functions he sent to Hardy. After his death, these papers returned to Cambridge, where they slipped out of sight for decades. They eventually became known as the Lost Notebook. For those who support the secret program theory, the disappearance of those pages was not simple neglect. They argue that the notebooks contained structures similar to wartime encryption patterns, and that storing them away kept sensitive ideas out of public hands. When George Andrews uncovered the papers in 1976, the war had been over for more than 30 years, and secrecy was no longer a concern. Yet believers still point to that long gap as evidence that Ramanujan's most advanced work might have been sealed away under layers of wartime confidentiality, rather than misplaced by accident. It makes you wonder who else at Cambridge might have seen something unusual in his work. The next part tries to answer that. The next theory reaches into Cambridge itself and claims there was far more happening behind its closed doors than lectures, research, and polite academic debate. It describes a hidden fraternity made up of scholars who treated mathematics as a sacred language, not just a tool for solving problems. According to this idea, the group guarded an old belief that numbers held spiritual power and that certain formulas could reveal truths that lie beyond ordinary understanding. Their meetings were said to involve quiet rituals that joined geometry with worship, where symbols, patterns, and numerical sequences were used to seek insight that they believed could not be reached through reason alone. Supporters of this theory say the fraternity kept a private ledger that listed individuals they watched closely, and one of those names was Ramanujan. The story claims this ledger was preserved through a few families tied to former members, and although the pages have never been made public, the descriptions passed down through generations mention a mathematician from India whose talent disturbed the group. They believe that Ramanujan's sudden rise in knowledge, especially in areas touching both physics and spirituality, placed him dangerously close to truths they had spent centuries guarding in silence. The argument grows stronger for them when they point to how different Ramanujan was from the rest of Cambridge. He did not follow the usual path of long proofs or academic rigour. Instead, he said the answers came to him fully formed. He described receiving formulas during sleep, waking with entire pages of results without showing the work behind them. To professors, trained in strict logic, this seemed odd. Hardy respected him but openly struggled to explain his process to the faculty. He thought Ramanujan's claims about divine inspiration might make colleagues doubt his seriousness, and there are stories about how he avoided discussing the spiritual side of Ramanujan's work in front of others. In the theory of the esoteric fraternity, these differences are exactly what made him threatening. For centuries, the group supposedly believed that true mathematical insight required ritual training, controlled study, and careful guidance passed only to chosen members. If someone outside their circle reached the same depth through intuition, prayer, or dreams, it would undermine everything they had built. It would show that their guarded process was not the only path. It would show that someone without their approval could unlock knowledge that they believed belonged only to them. Supporters also point to Ramanujan's fascination with sacred geometry, especially patterns linked to his devotion to Namagiri. They argue that the Sri Yantra, a form made from interlocking triangles arranged with perfect balance, mirrors the symmetry found in his work. They also note that the structures appearing in his formulas connect to older traditions that saw mathematics as a spiritual practice, not just an academic one. To believers, this overlap is not a coincidence. They claim the fraternity feared he might reveal how these sacred patterns connected to pure mathematics, bridging ideas they had spent generations keeping apart. The theory goes further by revisiting small stories from his years at Cambridge, such as the quiet visitors seen entering and leaving lodging houses where Ramanujan stayed. Most historians dismiss these as friends, staff, or tutors, but supporters say these were envoys from the fraternity, checking on the progress of his work, making sure he did not share results that touched on ideas they wanted to remain hidden. In these accounts, the visitors did not come to encourage him, but to limit him, giving subtle warnings or instructions presented as concern for his health or routine. For people who believe this version, Ramanujan was not only an outsider in British mathematics, but also a figure who unknowingly stepped into long protected territory. His talent let him reach concepts that the fraternity viewed as sacred knowledge, and his presence forced them to intervene in quiet ways. In their eyes, the fact that his most advanced notes disappeared for decades fits neatly into the story. They argue that the same group that monitored him during his life may have helped ensure that certain ideas stayed buried for as long as possible, waiting until the old guard faded and the secrecy no longer served a purpose. But if this story feels unusual, wait until you see what happens when we look at others who lived through something strangely similar. When people talk about minds that work differently, the AI names Évariste Galois and Nikola Tesla always seem to sit next to Ramanujan's. They shared the same odd mix of brilliance, obsession, and tragedy. Each of them made discoveries that didn't fully make sense until decades later, and each left behind mysteries that no one has completely untangled. Galois was only 19 when he built the foundation of group theory, the math that would later become essential to everything from quantum physics to cryptography. He was fearless and impatient, both in his politics and his work. Records from his time in France show that he was expelled from school, jailed during protests, and constantly writing down new mathematical ideas wherever he could find paper. The night before his death, he filled his letters with equations and notes, as if he knew time was running out. Police files from 1832 confirmed that he was shot in a duel at sunrise, and later investigations revealed that many of his papers were quietly collected and hidden after his death. It wasn't until mathematician Joseph Liouville published them years later that people realized what he had done. His theories had solved problems that wouldn't even be formally asked for another half-century. Tesla's story has the same eerie rhythm. He often described his ideas as arriving in sudden flashes of light. He said entire machines appeared in his mind, already designed and complete, before he ever touched a tool. In his notebooks, he wrote about wireless energy, limitless power, and devices that could send images and data through the air. Most people thought he was dreaming too big, yet his concepts would later become radio, radar, and even modern wireless technology. Reports from 1943 describe how Tesla died alone in his New York room. When authorities entered, they found trunks filled with strange machines and thousands of pages of notes. The FBI ordered MIT engineer John G. Trump to review them. Trump reported nothing dangerous, but many of the papers vanished from the record. Some historians believe they were archived under classified research. What connects Galois, Tesla, and Ramanujan is not just genius. It's that same sense of reaching into something beyond what the rest of us can see. Their work seemed to appear whole, without drafts or hesitation, like information being transferred instead of discovered. And just like Ramanujan, both men died before they could explain what they truly meant, leaving behind only fragments that still feel ahead of their time. But not everyone agrees with these ideas, and some critics have plenty to say about why they think none of this adds up. Many believe Ramanujan had strange visits before his death, and that these moments may have played a role in what happened to him. But when historians went back through the records, they found nothing that supports the idea of unknown visitors showing up at his home or affecting his final months. Researchers who combed through the Madras archives noted that the police files for that period are fully intact, and none mention unusual activity at his address. Local station logs list disturbances as simple as noise complaints and minor thefts, yet there is not a single entry about anyone watching his house, delivering secret packages, or coming and going at odd hours. Several academic reviewers studied the original letters exchanged between Ramanujan, his wife Janaki, his colleagues, and the University of Madras staff. They say these letters are straightforward and surprisingly ordinary. They focus on his declining health, requests for medical help, and updates about his work. Not a single line hints at meeting unfamiliar people or being approached for hidden purposes. Scholars point out that Ramanujan wrote openly about hardships and frustrations. If he'd been receiving unwanted visits or felt watched, they believe he would have mentioned it somewhere. Some say the rumours only grew because there were gaps in his medical story, and people filled those gaps with fantasy. Biographers explain that cultural memory in his hometown often blended miracle stories with real events, especially when speaking about someone considered gifted or touched by something greater. Over time, those memories blurred into tales of late-night visitors and whispered conversations at the gate. But when historians checked the surviving family accounts, none included descriptions of strangers arriving in secret. Others argue that the narrative of hidden visitors simply does not match how colonial authorities operated. If British agents had wanted contact with him, there would have been official entries, receipts, or travel notices, because nearly everything involving foreign personnel was logged. Scholars who specialise in British India administration say that the absence of paperwork is a strong sign that no such encounters took place. For people who rely on documented history rather than dramatic narrative, the conclusion is simple. They say the mysterious visitor story survives only because it adds excitement, not because it rests on evidence. In their view, the absence of proof after so many years is not a gap waiting to be filled, but a sign that the event never happened. Another popular story claims that Ramanujan left behind coded warnings in his final letters, messages that hinted at danger or secret knowledge. Some say his phrasing about being guided or shown things was actually a way of telling people he was being pressured. Others argue that a few odd sentences in his notes were disguised distress signals. It is an idea that has been repeated in documentaries, online forums, and books that try to link him to hidden societies or government plots. But historians who examine the original letters say these claims fall apart fast. The references people point to come from the same kind of devotional language he had always used since childhood. He often wrote about being inspired, or blessed and used, metaphors drawn from his faith to describe his ideas. There is no sudden shift in tone during his final months that would suggest he was sending coded messages. Some also say his final postcard to Hardy contains clues about pressure from outside forces, but experts argue that nothing unusual appears in the surviving copy. The message talks about his health, his ongoing interest in mathematics, and a few thoughts about mock theta functions. Nothing reads like a warning. Historians also point out that if he wanted to alert someone about danger, he would not have written to a man who openly complained about his lack of clarity and who often struggled to understand his casual remarks. Another myth claims that his sudden flashes of insight must have come from supernatural or technological sources, because no ordinary person could produce results without drafts or corrections. Some say this proves he hid a second set of papers, or had access to tools Cambridge mathematicians did not know about. Researchers who looked closely at his writing habits say this assumption has no real support. He worked rapidly, relied on intuition, and wrote down results once he felt they were correct. He did not keep notebooks filled with rough work. His style was unusual but not impossible. Other prodigies in history worked the same way, including Galois, who wrote essential mathematics in the margins of letters and on scraps the night before his death. Mathematicians who analyse Ramanujan's work explain that his shortcuts can be understood through training, memory, and years of obsession with number patterns. Some say his talent makes people reach for dramatic explanations because intuition at his level looks supernatural from the outside. Others argue that the fact that his ideas were later proven correct does not mean they came from hidden sources. It simply shows he was one of those rare minds who could see structure without needing every step written out. In the end, Ramanujan's life is still full of mystery. He died young, just 32, but in that time, he changed math in ways few ever have. His notebooks, especially the famous Lost Notebook, keep surprising and challenging mathematicians even today. Whether his work unlocked secrets of the universe, pointed to hidden knowledge, or just showed how powerful human creativity can be, it reminds us how close imagination and discovery really are. No matter what's true about all the stories and theories, Ramanujan's legacy lives on as a reminder of how mystery can inspire the search for understanding.